December 2025, Shanghai. The world's largest automated port processes 47 million containers annually. Not a single American component in the entire operation. While you argue about politics, China is systematically dismantling every pillar of American power, and most of you have no idea it's happening. This is not about politics. This is about power. Real power. The kind that determines which currency you use, which products you can buy, and whether your children will live in a country that sets global rules or follows them. For 75 years, the United States has been the dominant global power. That era is ending. Not in 20 years, not in 10 years. The transition is happening right now, and by 2040, China will be the world's dominant superpower. This video will show you exactly how China is executing this takeover, the 5 specific mechanisms they're using, the timeline of how American dominance collapses, and what it means for your future. Because understanding this transition is the difference between positioning yourself correctly and getting destroyed by the largest wealth transfer in modern history. Let's start with how we got here, because this pattern has happened before. In 1870, Britain was the world's unchallenged superpower. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's land and population. British manufacturing produced 32% of global industrial output. The Royal Navy ruled every ocean. The pound sterling was the only currency that mattered. British technology led the world. Britain was permanent. Britain was inevitable. Britain was forever. Except it wasn't. Beneath the surface, Britain was rotting. British companies stopped innovating. British manufacturing became inefficient. Britain overextended militarily, maintaining expensive colonies that drained resources. British debt exploded to finance imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, America was building. American steel production grew explosively. By 1900, the United States produced 10 million tons of steel annually compared to Britain's 5 million. American innovation in electricity, automobiles, and oil refining surpassed British capabilities. American infrastructure was being built at a scale Britain couldn't match. By 1914, when World War I began, America had already overtaken Britain as the world's largest economy. Most people didn't notice. The transition was invisible to those not paying attention. World War I accelerated everything. Britain entered the war in 1914 and emerged in 1918 victorious, but bankrupted. British debt increased 11-fold. Britain owed enormous sums to the United States. The British economy was shattered. America emerged as a creditor nation, holding most of the world's gold. By 1944, when the Bretton Woods Conference formalized the post-war monetary system, the transition was complete. The dollar replaced the pound as the reserve currency. American military power guaranteed global security. The American century had begun. The transition from British to American dominance took 74 years. It followed a clear pattern. The rising power built economic strength, invested in technology and infrastructure, avoided costly wars, and accumulated financial reserves. The declining power overextended militarily, accumulated unsustainable debt, and lost its economic edge. Now, apply this exact pattern to today. The United States in 2025 looks identical to Britain in 1914. America is overextended militarily, maintaining 750 bases in 80 countries and fighting expensive wars that drain resources. U.S. national debt has exploded to $36.2 trillion, 125% of GDP. American infrastructure is crumbling. American manufacturing has been offshored. American political dysfunction prevents long-term strategic planning. Meanwhile, China is following the exact playbook America used to overtake Britain. Build economic strength through manufacturing dominance. Invest heavily in infrastructure and technology. Avoid costly foreign wars. Accumulate gold and resources. Wait for the declining hegemon to weaken through overextension and debt. Then challenge systematically across every domain. Let me show you the 5 mechanisms China is using right now. Mechanism 1. Economic dominance through manufacturing scale. China is the world's largest manufacturer, producing more than 1/3 of all manufactured goods globally. More than the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. This isn't cheap plastic toys. This is advanced manufacturing across every sector. China produces 60% of the world's solar panels, 75% of lithium-ion batteries, 80% of rare earth magnets used in electronics and defense systems, 70% of the world's smartphones, 50% of the world's steel. China builds more ships than the rest of the world combined. China produces more electric vehicles than all other countries combined. China manufactures more industrial robots than any other nation. Manufacturing dominance creates strategic leverage. When you control production of essential goods, you control supply chains. When you control supply chains, you control which countries can access critical products. When you control access, you have geopolitical power. The United States learned this lesson during COVID. 95% of antibiotics came from China. 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients came from China. 70% of personal protective equipment came from China. When supply chains broke, America couldn't produce these essentials domestically. The manufacturing capacity no longer existed. The factories had moved to China decades ago. But China isn't stopping at being the world's factory. China is moving up the value chain into high-technology manufacturing that generates higher profits and creates strategic dependencies. In 2010, 30% of Chinese exports were high-technology goods. By 2024, over 50% of Chinese exports are classified as high technology: semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, aerospace components, electric vehicles, advanced machinery. China exported $340 billion in high-tech goods in 2024, exceeding U.S. high-tech exports of $280 billion. More significantly, China is diversifying export markets away from the United States. In 2018, the U.S. represented 19% of Chinese exports. By 2024, the U.S. represents just 15%. China's trade with ASEAN nations has exploded to over $950 billion annually, surpassing China-U.S. trade. China-Africa trade exceeded $280 billion. China-Latin America trade hit $490 billion. This diversification means China is less vulnerable to American economic pressure. When the U.S. imposed tariffs in 2018, China didn't collapse. China redirected exports to other markets and imposed counter-tariffs on American agricultural products. The trade war didn't stop China's rise. It accelerated China's strategy to reduce dependence on American markets. And China is locking in these relationships through the Belt and Road Initiative. Over $1 trillion invested in infrastructure projects across 150 countries: ports, railways, highways, power plants, all financed and built by Chinese companies using Chinese equipment. These aren't charity projects. These are strategic investments creating permanent economic dependencies. The digital Silk Road is even more critical. China is building 5G telecommunications networks, fiber optic cables, satellite systems, and digital infrastructure across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. When countries adopt Chinese technology standards for telecommunications, they become dependent on Chinese equipment, Chinese software, and Chinese technical support forever. Huawei and ZTE have installed 5G networks in over 70 countries. These networks will carry the internet traffic, financial transactions, and communications of billions of people, and China will have influence over all of it. The digital infrastructure that will define the 21st century is being built by China, not America. Whoever controls the infrastructure controls the future. Mechanism 2. Technological leapfrogging in the industries that will define the next 50 years. China has identified artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, advanced materials, and aerospace as the strategic technologies of the 21st century, and China is pouring resources into these sectors at a scale America cannot match. Start with artificial intelligence. China has declared its ambition to be the global leader in AI by 2030. That's not a hope. That's a funded national strategy backed by tens of billions of dollars annually. Chinese AI labs are developing large language models and machine learning systems that increasingly match or exceed Western capabilities. Companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance are building AI systems trained on datasets larger than anything available to American companies. Why? Because China has access to data from 1.4 billion people with minimal privacy restrictions. Every search query, every purchase, every social media post, every movement tracked by surveillance cameras. All of this data is available to train Chinese AI systems. American companies are constrained by privacy laws. Chinese companies face no such constraints. This data advantage means Chinese AI systems can be trained faster with more examples, producing better real-world performance. AI is the foundational technology of the 21st century. AI will determine who leads in autonomous vehicles, robotics, drug discovery, financial systems, military targeting, cybersecurity, and virtually every other critical sector. If China achieves AI dominance by 2030, China will have a permanent technological advantage that compounds over time. China is also racing ahead in quantum computing, the technology that could break all existing encryption and revolutionize computing power. Chinese scientists have already demonstrated quantum communication satellites that can transmit encrypted data immune to interception. China has built quantum radar systems that can detect stealth aircraft. These aren't future projects. These are but perhaps China's most significant technological advantage is control of critical materials that enable all advanced technology. China dominates global production of rare earth elements, the minerals essential to electronics, defense systems, electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, and advanced manufacturing. China produces 60% of the world's rare earths and refines 85%. The United States produces 10% and refines almost none domestically. In 2025, Beijing imposed stringent export controls on rare earths and critical magnet materials. This wasn't random. This was strategic leverage. By controlling materials at the bottom of the supply chain, China can squeeze production of finished goods at the top of the chain. If China restricts exports of neodymium, a rare earth used in electric motors, American and European electric vehicle production slows. If China restricts gallium and germanium, essential for semiconductors, Western chip production suffers. The United States is trying to rebuild rare earth processing capacity, but this takes years and billions in investment. Meanwhile, China has 40 years of infrastructure, expertise, and economies of scale. America can't catch up quickly, and China knows it. Mechanism 3. Military modernization designed not to conquer the world, but to deny America the ability to project power in Asia. For 75 years, American military superiority was unquestioned. The U.S. Navy controlled the oceans. The U.S. Air Force controlled the skies. American technology was a generation ahead of any rival. That era is ending. Over the past 15 years, China has systematically transformed the People's Liberation Army from a territorial defense force into a fully capable multi-domain strategic military. The PLA Navy is now the largest navy in the world by number of ships. Over 370 vessels compared to the U.S. Navy's 290. More importantly, China is building modern, capable ships at a rate America cannot match. China launched 3 aircraft carriers in 12 years. The most recent, the Fujian, commissioned in 2024, features electromagnetic launch systems that match the technology on America's newest carrier. The Fujian can launch aircraft faster and more efficiently than older carriers. China is also deploying advanced stealth fighters. The Shenyang J-35, China's second fifth-generation stealth aircraft, makes China the only country besides the United States with two operational stealth platforms. The J-35 is designed for carrier operations. Chinese carriers will soon deploy stealth fighters just as U.S. carriers do. American technological superiority is eroding. But China's most significant military advances are in missiles and space systems. China has developed a range of anti-ship ballistic missiles designed specifically to destroy American aircraft carriers. The DF-21D and DF-26, nicknamed carrier killers, can strike moving ships at ranges exceeding 2,500 kilometers. These missiles make it extremely risky for U.S. carriers to operate near China's coast. If America can't safely deploy carriers in the Western Pacific, America loses the ability to project power and defend allies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. China has also expanded its space capabilities dramatically. China operates over 500 satellites for communications, surveillance, navigation, and targeting. Chinese satellites track U.S. military movements in real time. Chinese anti-satellite weapons can destroy American reconnaissance satellites, blinding U.S. forces. These capabilities are designed for one purpose: to make any U.S. military intervention in Asia so costly and risky that America won't attempt it. China doesn't need to defeat the U.S. military globally. China just needs to make U.S. intervention in the Western Pacific unacceptable, and China is succeeding. Every war game conducted by the Pentagon simulating a conflict over Taiwan shows heavy U.S. losses. Multiple aircraft carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of casualties. These aren't acceptable losses politically, which means America's ability to defend Taiwan is questionable. And if America can't defend Taiwan, American credibility across Asia collapses. Mechanism 4. Financial and economic reordering through de-dollarization and alternative institutions. China is systematically building the infrastructure to bypass the U.S.-dominated financial system. China is a driving force behind BRICS expansion and de-dollarization mechanisms, bilateral currency trade agreements that bypass the dollar entirely, massive gold accumulation. China holds an estimated 4,000 tons of gold through official and undisclosed channels. China has reduced treasury holdings from a peak of $1.3 trillion to approximately $770 billion. China is building CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, as an alternative to SWIFT, the Western-controlled payment network. CIPS processed $27 trillion in transactions in 2024, up from $12 trillion in 2022. More than doubling in 2 years. This financial infrastructure allows China to trade, invest, and conduct international transactions without touching the dollar or Western financial systems. When the U.S. froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, every country watched and learned. Dollar reserves can be seized. China is ensuring it never faces that vulnerability by building alternative systems before they're needed. China is also creating alternative international institutions that challenge U.S.-led organizations. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded by China in 2015, now has 109 member countries and has financed over $45 billion in infrastructure projects, directly competing with the World Bank. The new development bank, established by BRICS nations, provides financing without the conditions imposed by the IMF and World Bank. These institutions allow countries to access development capital without accepting American economic prescriptions or political alignment. This isn't just about finance. This is about creating a parallel international system where American influence is minimized and Chinese influence is maximized. Countries can choose, align with the U.S. and access dollar-denominated financing through the IMF and World Bank with political conditions, or align with China and access yuan-denominated financing through AIIB and the new development bank with fewer conditions but accepting Chinese influence. An increasing number of countries are choosing China, not because they love China, because China offers a better deal with fewer strings attached. Mechanism 5. Diplomatic influence and narrative warfare designed to portray China as a reliable partner and the U.S. as a declining, unreliable hegemon. China's diplomacy emphasizes non-interference in domestic affairs, mutual development, and win-win cooperation. This contrasts sharply with American diplomacy that often demands political reforms, human rights commitments, and alignment with U.S. strategic goals. For many developing countries, Chinese diplomacy is more attractive because it comes with fewer conditions. China has normalized relations with Saudi Arabia and Iran simultaneously, mediating a diplomatic breakthrough between two regional rivals in 2023. This demonstrated Chinese diplomatic capability in a region where the U.S. has struggled for decades. China is expanding partnerships across Africa, where over 40 countries have joined Belt and Road. China is deepening ties with Latin America, traditionally considered America's sphere of influence. China is building relationships with Pacific Island nations critical for strategic positioning. China is also conducting narrative warfare, portraying America as a declining power whose time has passed. Chinese media emphasizes American political dysfunction, rising inequality, infrastructure failures, gun violence, social division. The message is clear. America is declining, China is rising. Align with the future, not the past. This narrative resonates because it contains truth. American infrastructure is crumbling. American politics are dysfunctional. American society is deeply divided. Meanwhile, China builds high-speed rail, futuristic cities, and advanced technology. The visual contrast is powerful, and countries around the world see it. Now let me show you the timeline of how this transition unfolds. Because this is not instantaneous, it follows a predictable pattern. 2025 to 2030, the foundation phase. China continues building economic, technological, and military capabilities. Chinese GDP grows to approximately $21 trillion, closing the gap with the U.S. at $30 trillion nominal. But in purchasing power parity, China's economy is already 30% larger. China achieves leadership in AI by 2030 as planned. China deploys its fourth and fifth aircraft carriers. The yuan and CIPS continue processing increasing volumes of trade outside the dollar. American influence in Asia and Africa continues eroding as Chinese investment deepens. The U.S. is still dominant, but the trajectory is clear. 2031 to 2035, the acceleration phase. China's nominal GDP surpasses the U.S., making China the world's largest economy by any measure. This psychological threshold has profound implications. Countries align with economic power, not historical relationships. Chinese technological leadership in AI, quantum computing, and advanced materials becomes undeniable. Chinese military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific achieve parity with the U.S., making American intervention in any Taiwan crisis prohibitively costly. The dollar falls below 50% of global reserves as de-dollarization accelerates. American alliances begin fracturing as countries hedge by building relationships with China. The U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. A bipolar world has emerged. 2036 to 2040, the new order. China has become the dominant economic power, the technological leader, and the preeminent military force in Asia. The dollar stabilizes at 35 to 40% of reserves, similar to where the British pound stabilized after losing reserve status. A multipolar currency system includes the dollar, yuan, and potentially a BRICS common currency. American standard of living has fallen 20 to 30% as the trade deficit closes and cheap imports disappear. American military power is constrained to the Western Hemisphere and Europe. Asia is firmly in China's sphere of influence. The American century has ended, the Chinese century has begun. This timeline is not speculation. This is the pattern based on historical great power transitions and current trajectories. The British to American transition took 74 years. The American to Chinese transition will be faster, perhaps 40 to 50 years, from 1990 to 2040. Because modern technology accelerates everything. Now let me show you who wins and who loses. Because this is the largest geopolitical and economic shift in your lifetime. China obviously wins. China becomes the world's largest economy, the technological leader, the dominant military power in its region, and the center of a new economic bloc. Chinese companies will dominate global industries. The yuan will be a major reserve currency. Chinese cultural influence will spread globally. Countries aligned with China win. Nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East that build strong economic and diplomatic ties with China will benefit from Chinese investment, technology transfer, and market access. European countries that maintain neutrality will manage the transition. Europe's strategy is to avoid picking sides, maintaining economic ties with China while preserving security ties with the U.S. This is unstable long-term, but in the near term, it allows Europe to benefit from Chinese growth while avoiding American anger. The United States loses the most. America loses the exorbitant privilege of printing the reserve currency. America loses the ability to run permanent trade deficits. America loses technological leadership in the industries that matter most. America loses military dominance in Asia, forcing a retreat to a smaller sphere of influence. American living standards fall as cheap imports disappear and reshoring production raises costs. This is the inevitable consequence of declining relative power. American allies in Asia face impossible choices: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. All must decide whether to maintain alignment with a declining America or accommodate a rising China. Aligning with China means accepting Chinese dominance. Aligning with America means economic isolation from the world as largest economy and risking military conflict with a stronger neighbor. Most will try to hedge, maintaining security ties with the U.S. while building economic ties with China. But hedging becomes impossible when forced to choose. American workers lose jobs and wages as manufacturing that might have reshored to America instead goes to other countries. Even if production leaves China, it goes to Vietnam, India, or Mexico, not back to expensive American labor. American consumers lose purchasing power as imports become more expensive. The cheap goods from China that have subsidized American living standards for 30 years disappear. Prices on electronics, clothing, furniture, and consumer goods rise 30 to 50%. Americans discover that their lifestyle was built on Chinese manufacturing, and without it, they're much poorer. American investors lose wealth as Chinese companies increasingly dominate global markets, and American companies lose market share. The S&P 500 underperforms Chinese equity indices as Chinese technology companies achieve global dominance. The wealth transfer from this transition is estimated at $20 to $30 trillion over 30 years, flowing from American economic interests to Chinese and aligned nations. Now let me address the argument that China will stumble, that China's economy will collapse, that demographics will doom China, that authoritarianism prevents innovation. These arguments are wishful thinking by Americans who don't want to accept decline. Yes, China faces challenges. China's population is aging. China's debt is high. China's political system is authoritarian and repressive. But these challenges don't prevent China from overtaking a declining America. Britain faced challenges in 1900, but America still overtook Britain. China's challenges are manageable compared to America's structural problems. America is politically dysfunctional. Gridlock prevents action on infrastructure, debt, or strategic planning. America is deeply divided socially, trust in institutions at record lows. America has accumulated $36.2 trillion in debt with no plan to repay it. America has offshored its manufacturing base and can't quickly rebuild it. America is militarily overextended and financially constrained. China's system, while repressive, allows long-term strategic planning and rapid resource mobilization. When China decides to build high-speed rail, it builds 42,000 kilometers in 15 years. When America decides to build high-speed rail, it spends 20 years debating and produces nothing. When China decides to dominate solar panel production, it subsidizes the industry and achieves 60% global market share in a decade. When America tries to rebuild semiconductor manufacturing, it passes a bill, argues about implementation, and takes years to break ground. China's authoritarian system has advantages in strategic competition. It can focus resources, suppress dissent, and maintain consistency across decades. America's democratic system, while morally superior, is bad at long-term competition. Because leadership changes every 4 years and partisan fighting prevents sustained strategy. So what do? How do you position yourself for a world where China is the dominant power? First, accept reality. The American century is ending. China's rise is not reversible at this point. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you can position accordingly. Second, diversify geographically and financially. Don't assume American assets will outperform. Consider investments in Asian markets, emerging markets aligned with China, and Chinese companies that will dominate future industries. This doesn't mean abandon American investments. But don't be 100% concentrated in a declining power. Third, learn about China. Most Americans know nothing about Chinese history, culture, language, or strategic thinking. If China will dominate the 21st century, understanding China is essential. Read Chinese history. Learn Mandarin if possible. Understand how Chinese leaders think. This knowledge will be valuable. Fourth, develop skills that have value in a multipolar world. If your career depends on American dominance, you're vulnerable. Skills in technology, engineering, science, and international business will remain valuable. Skills dependent on American government spending or American consumer spending are riskier. Fifth, prepare for higher costs and lower living standards. The cheap imports that have sustained American consumption are ending. Prepare psychologically and financially for a world where goods cost 30 to 50% more and wages do not keep up. Sixth, pay attention to Asia. The center of global economic and political power is shifting east. What happens in Beijing, Shanghai, Singapore, Tokyo, and Seoul increasingly matters more than what happens in Washington or New York. If you're not watching Asia, you're not watching where the future is being built. Seventh, avoid overestimating American ability to reverse decline. Many Americans believe America will wake up and rebuild its strength. This is unlikely. The political will doesn't exist. The financial resources are constrained by debt. The time required to rebuild manufacturing and technology capabilities is measured in decades, not years. America's decline is structural, not temporary. The China challenge is not a future threat. It's today's reality. In December 2025, China produces more manufactured goods than America. China is leading in AI development. China operates the world's largest navy. China is building the financial infrastructure to bypass the dollar. China is locking in long-term economic relationships across 150 countries. China is positioned to become the dominant power by 2040. The transition from American to Chinese dominance is inevitable unless America takes dramatic action. And there's no sign America will take that action. American politics are focused on internal battles, not external competition. American resources are constrained by debt. American society is divided. China is unified, focused, and executing a strategy that has worked for 30 years. This is the same pattern that played out from 1870 to 1944 as America overtook Britain. The rising power builds economic strength, invests in technology, avoids costly wars, and waits for the declining power to weaken through overextension. Then the transition happens. not through war, but through mathematics. The stronger economy, the better technology, the more efficient system wins. In 1944, Britain didn't choose to lose dominance. It lost because America was simply stronger. In 2040, America won't choose to lose dominance. It will lose because China will be stronger. The only question is whether you'll recognize this reality before the majority does and position accordingly. Because the transition is happening now, the future is being built in Shanghai, not San Francisco. The dominant technology will be Chinese AI, not American AI. The reserve currency will be a multipolar system, not dollar dominance. The military superpower in Asia will be China, not America. Understanding this transition is the first step to navigating it successfully. The American century is ending, the Chinese century is beginning, and the transition will reshape every aspect of global politics, economics, and finance for the next 50 years. If this video opened your eyes to what's really happening, share it. Because most people are sleepwalking into the biggest geopolitical shift of their lives. The information is here. The patterns are clear. The question is whether you'll act on it. The future doesn't wait for those who refuse to see it coming.